Now let's talk about some of the basic lighting styles. One of the ones that we looked at in the lecture on portraiture was the Rembrandt light. Like here's an example of what we call a split light. You can see that the light is coming from one side. So you've got the one side of the face is lit and kind of a line right down the center and darkness on the other side. And when we were looking at lighting things you can do at home, one of the things I was talking about was just a simple reflector, just a piece of paper that you put in to reflect some light back in. So here's a split light, just with one light coming from the side. And in the studio, I had a large piece of foam core, and putting that in on the side just reflects some light back into the subject. So this is still just one light with that reflector on the side, reflecting some light back in. So there's the before and there's the after. So that's a split light, just split right down the middle, and then a little bit of a fill and kind of soften that out a bit. Now, the other type of lighting we took a look at was Rembrandt. And he was a painter back 16, 1700s, a long time ago. And he was known for a side light slightly to the front, and the nose would cast this shadow across the cheek. So you would end up with this kind of triangle of light. That's called Rembrandt lighting. And if you look at his paintings, you'll often see that he used this type of lighting. Now this is a fairly hard light that I was using. It's I took the big softbox off and I was just using the small reflector. So there was an LED light in it with a small reflector. So the light source is about this large. And you can see that the transition edge is quite hard. So you get this noticeable transition, hard shadow across here. A larger light source would give you a bit of a softer light. And adding a bit of fill will also give you a softer light. So again, this is just that foam core, that big sheet of white paper put in on the side there, and it just reflects some of that light back in. But you still see that shadow of the nose across the face there. And if you bring the light a little further around towards the front, you can get what's called a loop light. You notice that the shadow of the nose isn't quite connecting up on the side there. With the Rembrandt, you get that cutting off, that distinct triangle on the side. With the loop light, they call it loop because I guess, I don't know, it looks like I don't know why they call it a loop light, but that's a loop light there. And it's just the light pulled a little bit further around towards the front. So the Rembrandt is a little bit more towards the side. The split light is completely coming from the side. You can kind of see how that light's moving its way around towards the front. And there's that loop light with that small shadow of the nose. And again, with a little bit of a fill light, you can go from a fairly harsh lighting situation to a much softer sort of light. Here you kind of lose one side of the face. And if you're doing something like this at home, you probably won't be able to get this high of a contrast. In the studio here, we have these black velvet curtains behind that stop any light from reflecting around. If you're doing this at home, you're probably in a room that has light-colored walls, you probably have light-colored furniture, and all of that will kind of act as a reflector, and it'll bring a little bit of that lighting back in from the side there. So you might find that try to get this harsh of the lighting could be difficult at home. That being said, if you have like some dark sheets or something that you can kind of pin up, hang around, you can probably get something a little bit of a higher contrast. But that's a loop light. You can see just a little bit of fill light can soften that out. And if you pull the light around right to the front, so it's in front of the subject and up fairly high, you can get what's referred to as a butterfly light. And they say that the shadow of the nose kind of looks like a butterfly under there. I don't see it myself, but the higher you put the light, the more prominent that shadow becomes. And it is possible, of course, to go too high with that light there. But yeah, you might find if you're in a room that has a light on the ceiling and you use that as the main source of light, by moving the subject closer or farther away, so if you put them right underneath the light on the ceiling, and yet if that's the only source of light in the room, and you've got a fairly high contrast room, kind of dark walls and dark things around it, you can get something kind of like this, a little bit creepy looking. But if you move them back a little bit, so the light comes a little bit further forward, you can get that little shadow under the nose there. And you want the light to fall onto the eyes as well. When the eyes they're in the shadows there, it looks a little bit creepy. So you want to make sure that that light is forward enough that you get light on the face and on the eyes. That's referred to as a butterfly light. You can see the nice shadow of the chin onto the chest there. So that's with the subject facing straight forward. But if you turn them a little bit, you can place the light on one side or the other and end up with a couple of other style of lights. A broad light is when the light is shining onto the forward side of the face. So in this case here, we go right back to the butterfly. We've got the light on the left side here shining in towards her face. And That's the butterfly light. So the light is, so she's actually facing towards the light source. So you can see that little shadow under the nose there. But if we bring the light around towards the camera a little bit, so now the light is on the right side of the camera, shining onto this side of her face. So the side of the face that's toward the camera is lit up. This is referred to as broad lighting. And you'll notice that shadow of the nose, making that little loop of shadow there, not quite connecting, so you're not getting that triangle on the cheek. So this is a broad light with a loop light on it. And again, you can bring a little bit of fill in, and you can see how it just opens up the shadows in there. So when you're doing portraiture, if you have just like a big, either a white card or even a sheet of paper, get that in there and you can just put a little bit of reflection back into the image. Here's the Rembrandt light. And again, it's a broad Rembrandt because it's a broad light. The side of the face that's toward the camera, it looks a little bit wider because you're getting that light across the whole surface of it. So we call it a broad light with a Rembrandt. And you can see that shadow of the nose is crawling across and you're getting that little triangle of light there. And again, you can throw a little bit of fill light in there just to kind of open up those shadows. You can bring it around a little bit further into a full split light. So now the light is coming from the side. So this side of the face is lit. This side of the face is in shadow. And again, if you have a very high contrast room, very dark walls, you can actually get that side of the face to just disappear into the shadows there. Or if you want to brighten it up a little bit, you can throw the reflector in and get some fill in there. Now, with any of these, you'll notice that it has a very kind of two-dimensional sort of look. Like we can see the front, we don't really get a sense of the contours. Like you can see some highlights along the, the neck, along the side of the face here. But sometimes putting another light behind, and again, if you're in a room, let's say you have like a desk lamp, maybe a floor lamp, and then you have a light on the ceiling. If you put that light on the ceiling behind them, you can use that as what's called a hair light. So you've got that light kind of coming in from behind, and it just reflects off the back. And it helps separate them from the background, gives a little bit of extra dimensionality to them. So that's referred to as a hair light. I realize my mannequin here has no hair, but we still call it a hair light. Some people will call it a kicker if it's coming in from behind. A lot of people just call it a hair light. So these are all examples of broad light, where the light is coming from basically this kind of the same direction as the camera. So they're kind of lit up on the front side. If we move the light around, we can end up with what's called a short light. So we're starting at the same image here, that butterfly with the light coming from the side there. But imagine instead of moving the light towards the camera, we move the light to the side. So here's an example of that loop light again, except instead of the shadow going to the left of the image, it's going towards the right here. So we've got that little loop of the nose, and it's this, we call it a short light because the side of the face that's away from the camera is lit up. And there's that short light with fill. So a little bit of fill light on the side kind of brings that side of the head back in. Again, you probably won't be able to get this kind of contrast in a home situation, but in a studio situation, you can have just the lit side and then pure blackness on the far side. A little bit of fill can bring some of that light back in. And then we bring the light around to a Rembrandt. You can see now the nose shadows kind of connecting up. You get that triangle of light on the cheek. A very harsh sort of light. Again, we've got that very high contrast, a little bit of fill. Just brings that side of the face back in. And if we continue the light around, we can end up with that split light where one side of the face is lit and the other side of the face is in shadow. And a short split has a very stark sort of look to it. If you look on like a lot of movie posters and things, you'll often find that they'll kind of show one side of the face and the other side will be in darkness. Or sometimes they'll have like one side of the face kind of cut off the edge of the poster itself. A very harsh kind of light, but a little bit of fill, just kind of come in and open up those shadow areas in there. And then there's a little bit of a hair light coming from the behind. So this is basically the light has been pushed all the way around further than it was on the split light. Now it's kind of coming from behind almost as a hair light and a little bit of a fill. It's a very kind of a dark, mysterious kind of lighting in there. But those are all examples of short light where you've got the light coming from the side of the face that isn't towards the camera. So the broad side of the face is in shadows, or in this case, really in shadows. Now, are you limited to doing this in a studio? No. I set up something at home here. I've got, there's the mannequin, there's the camera, and I have a window light and a north-facing window and a south-facing window. So this is the north window. And, as the sun moves through the sky, it goes through the southern part of the sky. So a north window, it'll be lit by that very soft light to the north. Let's take a look at an example of what you can get with just a window light. So again, this is, you notice that the contrast isn't as stark as it was in the studio. You know, the dark side of the face is still being lit a little bit. The light comes in, it hits the walls, it hits furniture, it's going to reflect back in, it's going to fill a little bit. But if you want a little more control over it, if you want a bit of a lower contrast situation, here's just that white sheet of foam core that I brought in. So it starts out fairly stark, fairly high contrast. And by moving a reflector in, and you can move that reflector around and see how it changes on the image, lower, higher angles. It can have a big impact on how that light reflects off of, you know, the chin, the neck, the temple, the nose, even into the eyes. So this is just north-facing light, and you get that soft, notice the transition from the lit side to the shaded side it's a soft transition. The shadows are very soft. Oftentimes a softer light, that's why we use like soft boxes, great big soft light sources. It'll hide imperfections in the skin, whereas a hard light, like we were using in the studio there, they're a little bit more noticeable. Like you know, the hard edges across you know, transitions, you'll see more skin texture, more blemishes. So let's take a look at the north one here, and then I'll show you an example of the south light. So again, this is just that north light shining in from the front. Here we are looking straight on at the subject. Again, split light. Bring a reflector in, you can kind of light up those contours around the sides. If you turn her a little bit more, here we've got more of a broad light. It's kind of almost a split coming from the windowed side there. And again, you can see it gets fairly dark in the unlit side of the face. That reflector can just come in and light up those shadows. Play around with techniques like that. And if we turn her completely away from the window, you get this neat kind of silhouetted shape across the background. If you have a fairly bright background and you can block the light from the subject, you can get a neat silhouetted sort of effect. And if you don't want the silhouette, again, that reflector can just come in and light up those shadow areas. So those are examples of a nice soft northern facing window light. But if you have a south light, again, as that sun moves through the southern sky, it's going to shine directly in. So this is a south light. And you can see those transition edges are much harder. The shadow edges are much harder. And you can see a little bit of the texture on the mannequin head there. Whereas on the soft light, everything becomes almost like there's like a powder makeup applied to it. You get this very matte sort of surface. With that north light, it's a much harder sort of light. Not unpleasant, but certainly a much harder light. And again, you can get the reflector in there and kind of reflect some light back into the subject. It will make for things like the split light that much more dramatic. Here's an example of the split light. Now, notice also that harder edge shadow, it can fall really harshly onto parts of the face, like along the nose here, along the upper lip. Get a reflector in there. It's still, yeah, it's a little bit distracting. So watch for how those highlights fall onto the subject. And sometimes just a little bit of a turn can be enough to push those lit bits into the shadows there. So there's a little bit of a turn and a little bit of a fill light coming in. So again, you can see you still have that fairly harsh transition, and it's very easy to start losing your highlights. Now, if she'd had some hair on there, it wouldn't have been quite so bright in those highlight areas, but you notice that area there is pretty much just blowing out to white. So you do have to be more careful with your exposure as well if you're using a very hard light in there. But again, that reflector can just kind of come in and light up those shaded areas. And try to avoid things like lighting from below. It can get a bit of a demonic sort of look. And some other things to avoid when you're shooting portraits is looking up or down on the subject. Like here's looking straight on at the subject. You're at eye level. If you photograph from above, you get a bit of like kind of a domineering sort of look to the image. So you want to make sure that you're trying to keep about eye level with the subject. And if you go too low, you know, it can give them a bit of a towering sort of appearance, which might be the way you're going. You know, no one says these are hard and fast rules, but just in general, if you're just trying to do a nice little portrait, keep it about the same level as the subject there.